For more than 140 years, a stone mansion on Cleveland's Franklin Boulevard has been called cursed. People came looking for ghosts, hidden rooms, and bones in the walls. But the strangest part of Franklin Castle is not what legends claim happened inside it. It is what they got wrong. The deaths that made the house famous began before the castle was even finished, and that is where the real story starts. Franklin Castle was not built to frighten anyone. Before it became a landmark of ghost stories, before visitors came searching for cold rooms, hidden passageways, and figures in the windows, it was simply a house on a prosperous Cleveland street. Its stone walls were raised not as a warning, but as a promise. They belonged to a city that was growing fast, to an immigrant family that had risen with it, and to a man who wanted his home to say something permanent in a place where almost everything was changing. In the early 1880s, Cleveland was no longer a quiet lakefront town. It was a city of smoke, rail lines, iron, oil, shipping, breweries, factories, and men who had learned how to turn movement into money. Ships came and went across Lake Erie. Railroads pulled goods into the interior. Warehouses filled, banks expanded. Neighborhoods that had once sat at the edge of settlement became places where success announced itself in brick, stone, stained glass, and carved wood. On the west side of the city, Franklin Boulevard was one of those announcements. It was broad, orderly, and ambitious. The houses there were not workers' cottages or cramped boarding rooms. They were the homes of people who had begun to separate themselves from the noise that made their fortunes possible. Doctors, merchants, bankers, and industrial men looked toward streets like Franklin Boulevard because they offered something Cleveland's central districts could not always give them: space, dignity, and the appearance of calm. A grand house in such a place was never only shelter. It was a public sentence written in architecture. It told neighbors who you were, what you had survived, and what you hoped your name would mean after you were gone. The man who wrote that sentence at 4308 Franklin Boulevard was Hannes Tiedemann. He had been born in Germany and came to the United States as part of the great movement of European immigrants who reshaped American cities in the 19th century. In Cleveland, German immigrants built churches, clubs, businesses, breweries, newspapers, and neighborhoods. They brought language, music, customs, discipline, and ambition. Some remained laborers all their lives. Others moved upward through trade, savings, and the opportunities of a city still forming itself. Tiedemann became one of those men. He entered the wholesale grocery business, a field that may sound ordinary now, but in a growing 19th century city, food distribution was a serious enterprise. Before modern supermarkets, before refrigerated trucks and national chains, the movement of flour, sugar, coffee, spices, produce, and preserved goods required capital, connections, and trust. A successful wholesaler stood between farms, ports, railroads, shops, and households. He understood supply before most people saw the shelves. From there, Tiedemann moved into banking. The shift mattered. It placed him closer to the machinery of Cleveland's expansion. A banker did not only count money. He helped decide where money could go, who could build, who could borrow, and what kind of city would rise from the next set of investments. By the time Tiedemann planned his house on Franklin Boulevard, he was not trying to disappear into Cleveland. He was placing himself visibly inside it. The architects he chose, Cudell and Richardson, gave him a house that did not look timid. It rose in the Queen Anne style, but it borrowed the mood of an older Europe. Rough stone gave the exterior weight. A round tower pushed upward from the structure, making the house look less like a private residence than a small fortress. Tall windows cut through the stone. The roofline shifted and climbed. The building seemed to gather several identities at once: mansion, castle, immigrant memory, business card, family refuge. Later generations would look at those same features and see menace. They would see the tower and imagine watching eyes. They would see the heavy stone and imagine secrets sealed inside. They would see the old-world character of the place and turn it into Gothic evidence. But in 1883, when the house was completed, those features meant something else. They meant permanence. They meant taste. They meant that a German immigrant who had entered an American city and prospered there could build a home that looked as if it had always belonged to history. The house also had a social purpose. It was not meant to be a sealed private castle. Tiedemann wanted a place large enough for family, friends, visitors, and members of the German community passing through Cleveland. In that sense, the building was not born as a place of isolation. It was born as a place of reception. That detail matters because the later legend depends so heavily on enclosure. The haunted version of Franklin Castle imagines the house as a trap, a container for terrible acts, a place where doors close and never quite open again. The historical house began with a very different idea. It was meant to receive people. It was meant to hold gatherings. It was meant to make success visible and hospitality possible. Every building has a first identity, and this was Franklin Castle's first identity. Not cursed, but confident. Still, no house is built on architecture alone. It is built on the lives of the people who ask it to stand. Behind the stone walls was a family already marked by loss. Hannes and his wife, Louise, had known the kind of grief that 19th-century families often carried with them in silence. Children died young in that period with a frequency modern Americans can hardly imagine. Measles, diphtheria, typhus, diabetes, infections, and fevers moved through homes before medicine had reliable answers. A child could be healthy in one season and buried in the next. A family photograph could become outdated not because people had aged, but because someone in it was gone. This is where Franklin Castle's story has often been told carelessly. For decades, legends placed death inside the mansion as if the house itself had caused it. The stories grew more elaborate with time. They spoke of children, locked rooms, hidden crimes, and a family destroyed behind stone walls. But several of the losses most often attached to the house occurred before the house was even finished. The chronology does not support the legend in the form many people know it. That does not make the grief imaginary. It makes it more human. The Tiedemann family did not need a curse to suffer. They lived in a century when death entered respectable homes, wealthy homes, immigrant homes, and poor homes without asking permission. Money could buy space, servants, fine materials, and a position on Franklin Boulevard. It could not buy the medical certainty that later generations would take for granted. So the house rose after loss, not outside it. Its tower and stone did not create tragedy. They were built in the shadow of it. That is a quieter truth than the legends, but it is also a more serious one. Franklin Castle was not born evil. It was born from the same forces that shaped much of 19th-century America: immigration, ambition, commerce, family pride, public display, and private mourning. The building's first story was not about a curse. It was about a man trying to build something stable in a world that had already shown him how unstable life could be. And perhaps that is why the later stories found such a willing host. A cheerful house leaves little room for invention. A wounded house invites it. Franklin Castle had the shape of a fortress, the history of a grieving family, and the silence that follows people when records grow thin and memory begins to loosen. Over time, those spaces would be filled by rumor. Names would be changed. Dates would be moved. Ordinary illness would become accusation. Architecture would become evidence. But at the beginning, before the tours, before the fires, before the bones in the wall, before Cleveland learned to call it haunted, the house on Franklin Boulevard stood as a promise. It promised arrival. It promised belonging. It promised that stone could hold a family together. The tragedy of Franklin Castle is that, long before anyone called it cursed, that promise had already begun to fail. The stone house on Franklin Boulevard looked as though it had been built for certainty. Its tower rose above the street with the confidence of a man who had made his place in the city. Its walls were thick. Its rooms were generous. Its exterior suggested age even when the building was new, as if Hannes Tiedemann had not merely constructed a home, but imported a sense of permanence from the old world and set it down in Cleveland. But permanence was the one thing his family had not been able to keep. To understand Franklin Castle, it is necessary to step away from the later stories for a moment. The legends make the house feel crowded with violence. They fill the rooms with suspicion, secret chambers, unnatural deaths, and a father turned into something monstrous. Those stories have power because they are simple. They give grief an author. They give suffering a villain. They make every shadow seem intentional. The real family history is harder to hold. Hannes Tiedemann and his wife, Louise, belonged to a generation that lived close to death in ways modern families rarely do. In 19th century America, a household could be respectable, prosperous, and carefully managed, and still be unable to protect its children from disease. Wealth changed the size of a room. It changed the quality of a doctor one could summon. It changed the food on the table and the clothes in the wardrobe. But it did not change the basic helplessness of parents facing illnesses that medicine had not yet learned to defeat. Before the family ever settled into the mansion at 4308 Franklin Boulevard, Hannes and Louise had already buried children. That fact is often passed quickly in haunted retellings because it does not behave like a ghost story. It does not point cleanly toward a secret. It points toward the ordinary cruelty of the age. Measles, diphtheria, typhus, and other childhood diseases were not rare visitors in the 1800s. They were part of the architecture of family life. They entered homes without regard for status. They did not need locked doors, hidden passages, or human malice. Among the losses later attached to Franklin Castle was the death of Emma Tiedemann, a daughter who died in 1881 as a teenager. In many versions of the legend, her death becomes one more dark event inside the house. But the dates matter. The house was not completed until 1883. Emma did not die within the walls that later stories assigned to her. The mansion inherited her memory after the fact. That single correction changes the entire moral shape of the story. If Emma died before Franklin Castle was finished, then the house was not the cause of that grief. It was one response to it. The building did not create the wound. It rose after the wound was already there. This does not make the story less tragic. It makes it more intimate. A haunted legend can flatten people into symbols: the cruel father, the doomed child, the grieving wife. History asks for more restraint. Hannes Tiedemann was not merely the man whose name became attached to a cursed house. He was a German immigrant who had climbed through Cleveland's commercial world, made money in wholesale groceries, moved into banking, and built a house large enough to display not only wealth, but usefulness. Louise was not simply a sorrowful figure in a ghost story. She was a wife and mother whose domestic life unfolded under pressures that the public record only partly preserves. Records can tell us when people died. They can tell us where a house stood, who owned it, and when it changed hands. But they rarely tell us how a family carried silence from one room to another. They do not tell us what habits grief created at breakfast, what objects were kept, what names were avoided, or what anniversaries passed heavily through a household. The absence of those details is not permission to invent them. It is a reminder that the dead deserve accuracy more than decoration. The Tiedemann house was large enough for more than private grief. It was also built with the idea of hospitality. Hannes intended the home to welcome relatives, friends, and members of Cleveland's German community who needed a place to stay. That matters because it places the family inside a living social world. The mansion was not first imagined as a sealed fortress. It was connected to migration, language, kinship, and the mutual aid that helped immigrant communities survive in American cities. For a German newcomer in Cleveland, such a house would have meant more than comfort. It would have meant that someone had already crossed the difficult distance between arrival and belonging. Inside those walls, the old language could be spoken, customs could be preserved, contacts could be made. A city that might feel strange at street level could become more navigable through a familiar door. The later name, Franklin Castle, makes the building sound isolated, almost medieval, as if it belonged outside ordinary life. The original idea was closer to the opposite. It was a house built by someone who had found a place in the American city and wanted that place to serve others from the world he had left behind. This is the part the legend nearly erased. By turning Hannes into a dark figure and the house into a chamber of secrets, the ghost stories pushed aside the more complicated truth of immigrant success and family sorrow. They made the house more entertaining, but less human. They turned illness into suspicion. They turned mourning into spectacle. They turned a family name into a warning. And yet one can understand why the stories clung to the building. A mansion with a tower already invites the imagination. A family marked by early deaths gives that imagination material. A name associated with money and status makes private suffering seem somehow suspicious, as if tragedy among the wealthy must have a hidden explanation. People often prefer a scandal to a cemetery record. A scandal feels like a discovery. A cemetery record feels like an ending. But Franklin Castle's darkness does not require us to believe every rumor. It asks something more difficult. It asks us to sit with a family whose losses were real, whose home was real, and whose memory was later rearranged by strangers. When Hannes and Louise entered the completed mansion, they were not beginning a fairy tale. They were moving into a house that carried absence from its first occupied day. The rooms were new, but the family history was not. The stone was fresh, but the names of the dead had already been spoken elsewhere. Every polished surface, every high window, every carefully designed room existed beside what could not be restored. That is why the house feels so different when the chronology is put back in order. It was not born cursed. It was born after mourning. And once a house begins its life as a shelter for grief, the world will eventually find ways to decide what that grief must mean. A house can tell the truth and hide it at the same time. The Tiedemann house did both. From the street it spoke in the language of success. Its stone face was not soft or domestic in the ordinary sense. It did not lean toward the passerby with warmth. It stood with weight. The rounded tower, the high roof line, the carved details, and the irregular massing gave the house the presence of something older than Cleveland itself, though it had only just arrived there. It borrowed from Europe, from memory, from the architecture of castles and estates, and placed those borrowed forms in a young American industrial city. That choice was not accidental. In the late 19th century, wealthy Americans often used architecture to explain themselves. A house could say that its owner was refined, established, moral, educated, modern, traditional, or powerful. It could place a family into an imagined lineage, even when the family fortune was new. For immigrant families, the message could be even more complicated. The house had to say that one belonged in America without surrendering every trace of the world that came before. At 43028 Franklin Boulevard, Hannes Tiedemann built with that tension in mind, whether consciously or not. The house was American in its location and ambition, but European in its mood. It stood in Cleveland, but it remembered Germany. It belonged to a banker and businessman, but it looked as if it might have belonged to a noble family from another century. It was private property, but it performed in public every day. That performance mattered. Franklin Boulevard was a stage of respectability. Families who lived there did not need to announce themselves in newspapers every morning. Their homes did it for them. Each facade became a kind of biography. Brick, stone, ironwork, bay windows, porches, and towers all became evidence of arrival. In a city built on labor and commerce, architecture offered a way to turn money into dignity. The Tiedemann house did this with unusual force. It did not merely say that its owner had prospered. It said he had endured. It said that his family name was now heavy enough to be set in stone. But stone has a strange double meaning. It suggests security, yet it also suggests burial. It promises endurance, yet it remembers loss. The same walls that made the house look strong also made it look sealed. The same tower that suggested romance later suggested watchfulness. The same European character that once announced refinement would later be read as darkness. This is one reason Franklin Castle became so vulnerable to legend. Its architecture already looked like a story waiting to be darkened. A plain house can hold tragedy and remain plain. A castle-shaped house cannot. People expect it to mean something. They search its windows for intention. They treat its rooms as if they must contain secrets equal to its appearance. Once the Tiedemann family losses became attached to the building, the architecture gave those losses a setting more dramatic than the facts themselves. Yet, in the beginning, the house's drama served a different purpose. It gave grief a formal exterior. No record allows us to enter the private thoughts of Hannes or Louise Tiedemann as they moved through those rooms. We cannot say exactly what they felt when the first lamps were lit, or when guests arrived, or when the house settled at night. But we can say that the building belonged to a family already acquainted with absence. It was not raised in innocence. It was raised after funerals, after illness, after the death of children whose names would later be folded into stories the house itself did not create. That distinction is important. The mansion was not a murder weapon. It was not an explanation. It was a container. It contained wealth. It contained hospitality. It contained the pride of a German immigrant who had made himself useful to a growing American city. It contained the routines of a household. It contained language, meals, visitors, servants, business conversations, family obligations, and the quiet social labor expected of a house of that size. And it contained grief, because all houses eventually do. In the Tiedemann house, grief and status did not cancel each other. They lived side by side. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of grand homes. Their beauty does not protect the people inside them from ordinary human suffering. Sometimes it makes the suffering harder to see. A mansion can turn sorrow into rumor because observers assume that wealth must either prevent pain or conceal scandal. When pain appears anyway, imagination begins its work. The public saw the stone. It did not see the private cost of living after loss. The house's size also changed the emotional scale of that loss. In a small home, absence gathers in a chair, a bed, a corner of the table. In a mansion, absence can spread. It can occupy unused rooms, it can travel down staircases, it can become part of the acoustics. Large houses do not erase emptiness, they give it more places to stand. This does not mean the house was gloomy from the beginning. That would be another kind of invention. There would have been ordinary days, doors opening, visitors arriving, domestic tasks completed, conversations in German and English, business associates received, relatives welcomed. The house would have had seasons of light, warmth, and usefulness. But the building's later reputation makes it difficult to imagine those ordinary days. Once a house is called cursed, every neutral detail is forced to testify. A tower becomes ominous. A corridor becomes suspicious. A locked room becomes evidence. Even silence becomes a witness for the prosecution. History has to resist that habit. The Tiedemann house should first be seen as a work of architecture, a social statement, and a family dwelling built under the pressure of memory. It was grand because Hannes Tiedemann had succeeded. It was European because identity still mattered. It was strong because stone could say what words could not. And it was vulnerable because no building, however carefully designed, can control the story that later generations decide to tell about it. That was the hidden weakness in the house from the start. Not a curse, not a ghost. A gap between appearance and truth. From the sidewalk, the house looked complete. It looked armored against time. It looked like a family had solved the problem of belonging by building something too solid to question. But behind the stone was a human story still unfinished, and the building itself was beginning a longer life than any of its first occupants could control. The Tiedemann family had given the house its first meaning. Soon time would begin taking that meaning away. A house does not become empty all at once. It begins in smaller ways. A room is used less often. A familiar voice no longer travels down the staircase. A chair remains in place, but the person who gave it meaning is gone. The address is the same. The walls still stand. From the street, nothing essential appears to have changed. Inside, everything has. For the Tiedemann house, that change came with Louise. Louise Tiedemann had lived long enough to see the mansion completed, occupied, and folded into the life her husband had built on Franklin Boulevard. She had known the house not as an object of legend, but as a working domestic world, a place of rooms, responsibilities, guests, meals, family memory, and the quiet order expected of a prosperous household. To later visitors, she would become one of the spectral figures attached to the mansion. To history, she was something less theatrical and more important. She was the woman whose absence altered the future of the house. Louise died in 1895. By then, the Tiedemann house had stood for just over a decade. In the life of a stone building, that is almost nothing. The walls were still young. The carved details had not yet softened with age. The tower had not yet become a symbol of haunting. The name Tiedemann still belonged naturally to the door. But the family meaning of the house had changed. The mansion had been built partly as a declaration of arrival, and partly as a shelter from the instability that had already touched the family. With Louise gone, its first purpose weakened. A year later, Hannes Tiedemann sold the house. That decision is one of the quietest turning points in the history of Franklin Castle. It does not have the spectacle of bones in a wall or fire in the night. It does not belong to the language of curses. Yet it may be the moment when the building began to separate from the people who made it. When a family leaves a house built so specifically for its own image, the structure enters a different life. It is no longer an extension of one household's ambition. It becomes property. It can be bought, renamed, divided, repaired, misunderstood, improved, neglected, or explained by strangers. The first story does not disappear, but it loses its authority. That is what happened on Franklin Boulevard. The Tiedemann house remained in place, but the Tiedemann family no longer governed its meaning. The stone, the tower, the heavy old-world character, the rooms built for hospitality and display, all of it survived. But the original voice of the house had gone quiet. New owners could occupy it. Neighbors could talk about it. Later writers could decorate it with rumor. The building could no longer correct them. This is one of the reasons old houses become vulnerable to legend. Their first occupants die. Their children move away. Household papers are lost. Servants, guests, and neighbors carry fragments of memory, but fragments are not the same as a record. A fact becomes an anecdote. An anecdote becomes a local story. A local story becomes tradition. Then, eventually, tradition is repeated with the confidence of evidence. Franklin Castle's later reputation depended on that kind of distance. As long as Hannes Tiedemann lived there, the house had a clear owner, a public identity, and a place in Cleveland's social landscape. After he sold it, the building entered a more unstable condition. It was still grand, but it was no longer anchored. It looked like a monument, but the family it commemorated had stepped away. Hannes himself did not vanish from Cleveland immediately. He lived on for more than a decade after the sale, dying in 1908. By that time, the house he had built had already begun its second life. His own biography remained tied to commerce, banking, immigration, and the rise of a German-American family in a growing city. But the public imagination would later reduce him to something far narrower: the man behind the haunted mansion. That reduction is one of the darker injuries in this story. A person can spend a lifetime building businesses, raising a family, participating in a community, and leaving behind a real civic footprint, only to be remembered through rumors that appeared long after he was gone. The dead cannot answer a bad story. They cannot correct a wrong date or refuse a role assigned to them by people who prefer drama to documentation. Once the Tiedemann name left the door, it became easier for later generations to use that name as material. The house also changed because Cleveland was changing. The wealthy residential world that had given Franklin Boulevard its original prestige was not fixed forever. Cities move, money moves, families move. Streets that once signaled arrival can become reminders of another era. As the 20th century approached, Cleveland continued to expand, industrialize, and rearrange itself. Houses built as private declarations of success often had to find new uses or new owners as the conditions around them shifted. The Tiedemann house was too large to be ordinary and too distinctive to disappear into the background. It demanded explanation. And when a building demands explanation after its first explanation is gone, people begin offering their own. For a time, however, the house did not yet belong to ghosts. It belonged to transition. That word is less dramatic, but more accurate. It passed from one hand to another. It waited for a new identity. It stood through years in which its stone face still carried the memory of the family that built it, while its rooms prepared for purposes the Tiedemanns could not have imagined. This middle period is easy to overlook because it lacks a single famous scene, but it is essential to the biography of the building. No house becomes a legend without first becoming detached from its origin. Franklin Castle had to stop being simply the Tiedemann home before it could become anything else. The sale after Louise's death did not curse the mansion. It loosened it. It loosened the bond between architecture and family. It loosened the bond between fact and memory. It loosened the authority of the people who knew what had actually happened there. From that point forward, the house could be renamed by use, by rumor, by fear, and eventually by commerce. A name on a door is a kind of protection. It tells the world whose story is being entered. When the Tiedemann name left the door, the house remained standing, but its first story stood unguarded. And into that unguarded space, another community would soon bring music, politics, language, and a different kind of memory. For nearly half a century, the house on Franklin Boulevard belonged not to ghosts, but to voices. They were not the voices later visitors claimed to hear in empty rooms. They were living voices, gathered in fellowship, argument, music, and memory. They spoke German and English. They carried the accents of immigration and the anxieties of belonging. They filled the old Tiedemann rooms with meetings, songs, civic concerns, and the complicated work of preserving an identity that America sometimes welcomed and sometimes distrusted. By the early 20th century, the house had already moved beyond its first life. It was no longer simply the Tiedemann residence. Its builder was dead. His wife was gone. The original domestic purpose had passed into memory. Yet the building had not become useless. Large houses often survive by changing their function, and this one found a new role that fit its origins more naturally than later legend would suggest. It became Eintracht Hall. The word Eintracht carries the meaning of unity, harmony, or concord. It was a fitting name for a house built by a German immigrant and later occupied by a German-American organization. Under that name, the mansion became a gathering place for Cleveland's German community. The private home became a public interior. The rooms that once represented one family's rise now served a broader circle of people who were trying to hold together language, heritage, music, and civic life in a changing American city. This was not a small matter. For German Americans, the early 20th century was a period of pressure. In the 19th century, German immigrants had helped shape cities across the United States. They built churches, schools, newspapers, mutual aid societies, beer halls, singing clubs, and cultural leagues. In Cleveland, as in many industrial cities, they were woven deeply into business, neighborhood life, and politics. Their associations gave newcomers a map. They offered friendship, employment contacts, language, ceremony, and a sense that the old world had not been entirely lost. But identity can become dangerous when world events change its meaning. During the First World War, German-American communities across the country faced suspicion. The German language, once a familiar part of immigrant neighborhoods, became politically burdened. German names were softened, hidden, or anglicized. Some public expressions of German culture were treated as signs of disloyalty. Even after the war ended, the old confidence did not fully return. To remain German-American in public required care. The house on Franklin Boulevard stood inside that tension. As Eintracht Hall, it was no longer just architecture. It was a vessel of cultural negotiation. Inside, people could gather under a name that meant harmony, while living in a country where harmony could not be assumed. They could sing songs from the old country, but they also had to define what loyalty meant in the new one. They could preserve heritage, but not without answering for a Europe that was becoming more unstable with every decade. This makes the building's fifth life one of its most important and least remembered. The haunted versions of Franklin Castle often skip this period because it does not behave like a ghost story. It has no easy villain. It has no hidden room. It does not offer the thrill of a scream in the dark. Instead, it offers something more historically valuable. A glimpse of how immigrant memory survives after the first family has gone. The Tiedemann House became a place where private success was transformed into communal endurance. One can imagine the change in sound. A family residence has domestic rhythms, footsteps at certain hours, doors opening for guests, meals served, conversations passing from parlor to hallway. A cultural hall has a different pulse. Chairs scrape across floors. Men and women arrive for meetings. Papers are read aloud, arguments rise and settle. Someone begins a song. Others join. The old rooms take in a chorus larger than the household for which they were designed. The building must have felt less like a castle then than a clubhouse, less like a relic than a working institution. And yet, the architecture still mattered. The tower, stonework, and old-world feeling gave the organization a setting with symbolic force. This was not an anonymous rented room above a storefront. This was a mansion built by a German immigrant who had made himself visible in Cleveland. For a German-American league to occupy such a house was to inhabit a kind of inheritance. It said that their culture had roots here. It said that German Cleveland was not temporary. It had buildings, it had memory, it had a place on the boulevard, but the world outside the house kept changing. By the 1930s, Germany itself had become a source of dread. The rise of Adolf Hitler placed German-American organizations in a painful position. Heritage could no longer be separated easily from politics. What did it mean to preserve German culture when the German state was being transformed by dictatorship, racial ideology, and military aggression? What did it mean to love a language, a song, a folk tradition, or a memory of home while rejecting what Germany's rulers were doing in Europe? Inside that pressure, Eintracht Hall became more than a social space. It became part of the public moral landscape. Members of the organization were not simply keeping old customs alive. They were also forced to clarify what kind of German identity could exist in America as Europe moved toward catastrophe. At least some in that community publicly opposed Hitler's aggression before the Second World War swallowed the continent. That fact complicates any simple reading of the building. It was not merely nostalgic. It was part of a community trying to separate culture from tyranny, memory from nationalism, heritage from obedience. The house had moved far beyond Hannes Tiedemann's original family purpose. It now contained the consequences of world history. That is one reason the Cursed Mansion label is too small for Franklin Castle. It reduces a complicated building to a spooky object, when its walls had already held a much broader American story. The house had witnessed immigrant ambition, private grief, civic respectability, cultural preservation, wartime suspicion, and moral conflict. Its darkness was not only in death. It was in the difficulty of belonging to more than one world at once. For decades, Eintracht Hall gave the building a living purpose. As long as people gathered there, the house was not abandoned to fantasy. It was still being used. It still answered a real need. It still connected the dead builder's world to the living city around it. But institutions age as surely as families do. By the 1960s, the old ethnic associations that had anchored immigrant life were weaker than they had once been. Younger generations moved outward, spoke less of the old language, and found belonging in different forms. Cities changed around them. Neighborhoods shifted. Large old houses became expensive to maintain. The cultural machinery that had once filled the rooms with voices began to thin. In 1968, the German club sold the house. With that sale, another name began to loosen from the door. The Tiedemann name had already left. Now Eintracht Hall began to fade as well. The building stood between identities again, stripped of the community that had given it sound, purpose, and public meaning for nearly 50 years. And this time, the silence did not remain empty for long. When the music left, rumor entered. When Eintracht Hall closed, the old house did not simply lose an owner. It lost an explanation. For nearly 50 years, the building had been understandable. It had been a German-American hall, a place of meetings, songs, and cultural life. People knew why the doors opened. They knew who gathered there. They knew what the house was for. Even if the original Tiedemann family had long since disappeared from its rooms, the building still had a public role strong enough to hold rumor at a distance. Then, in 1968, that role ended. The German club sold the house, and the mansion on Franklin Boulevard entered one of the most dangerous conditions an old building can face. It was still too strange to be ignored, but no longer familiar enough to be understood. Its tower still rose above the street. Its stone still gave it the look of a fortress. Its rooms still carried the traces of other lives. But the living institution that had explained it was gone. A house like that does not remain neutral for long. The name Franklin Castle began to take hold around this period, and the name itself changed everything. Tiedemann House sounded like history. It pointed toward a builder, a family, a city, and a specific social world. Eintracht Hall sounded like community. It pointed toward music, language, and immigrant life. But Franklin Castle sounded like a legend before anyone told one. It detached the building from biography and handed it to the imagination. A castle in Cleveland was already an invitation. It suggested age, secrecy, rank, imprisonment, and rooms not meant for ordinary people. The house had not changed its stones, yet the new name changed the way people looked at them. What had once been architectural drama became theatrical evidence. The tower became watchful. The narrow spaces became suspicious. The heaviness of the exterior began to feel less like success and more like concealment. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, stories about the house began to circulate with increasing force. They were not all the same. Some named Louise Tiedemann. Some named Emma. Some spoke of children dying inside the mansion, although the chronology did not support the most famous versions of those claims. Some added hidden rooms, unexplained sounds, secret panels, or dark acts without evidence strong enough to bear the weight placed upon them. This is how legends often form. They do not usually arrive as a finished book. They collect themselves in pieces. A wrong date is repeated because it feels right. A sad fact is moved into a more dramatic room. A large house becomes a vessel for every rumor that can fit inside it. One storyteller adds a detail. Another removes uncertainty. A third repeats the altered version, as if it had always been known. By the time a story has traveled through enough mouths, the original question disappears. People no longer ask, "Did this happen?" They ask, "Where in the house did it happen?" That shift is subtle but powerful. It turns speculation into geography. It makes rumor seem physical. Once a tragedy is assigned to a room, the room begins to carry the accusation. Visitors can stand there. Guides can point. The house itself appears to confirm the tale simply by existing. The Franklin Boulevard mansion was especially vulnerable to this kind of transformation because it already looked like a haunted house to 20th century eyes. American popular culture had trained people to read old stone, towers, staircases, and dim corridors as signs of danger. A building designed to suggest permanence in the 1880s could, a century later, suggest dread. The architecture had not become darker. The audience had changed. The city around it had changed as well. By the 1970s, many old urban mansions in the United States were caught between admiration and decay. Some became institutions, some became apartments, some were demolished, some were preserved, some waited, too expensive to maintain and too meaningful to tear down easily. In that landscape, a haunted reputation could become both a burden and a form of protection. It could cheapen a building's history, but it could also make people pay attention. Franklin Castle began to attract that attention. In the mid-1970s, one owner opened the house to the public for haunted tours, using the growing reputation as part of the experience. That decision marked another threshold in the building's life. Rumor was no longer only something whispered outside. It had entered the business model of the house. The mansion was now being presented not primarily as the Tiedemann residence, not as Eintracht Hall, not as a work of Cleveland architecture, but as a haunted attraction. The house had become a stage for its own distortion. That does not mean every person who came was foolish, or that every story was invented for profit. People are drawn to haunted places for many reasons. Some want fear, some want mystery. Some want contact with the past in a form more immediate than a plaque or archive can provide. A ghost story can make history feel close enough to touch, even when it also changes history into something less accurate. But the moral cost was real. The Tiedemann family became characters in a script they had not written. Louise was turned from a documented woman into a figure of restless sorrow. Emma, who died before the mansion was completed, was pulled into rooms she never occupied in life. Hannes, whose story belonged to immigration, trade, banking, and public success, began to appear in darker retellings as a suspect presence. a man around whom accusation gathered without the discipline of proof. The house itself was also changed. Its first meanings were not erased entirely, but they were buried under a more marketable identity. Architecture became atmosphere. Family grief became entertainment. The German-American years became a footnote. The name Franklin Castle began to overpower every name that came before it. This is the invention at the center of the story. Franklin Castle was not invented out of nothing. There had been real deaths in the Tiedemann family. There had been real sorrow. There had been a real old house with a formidable appearance. There had been real gaps in the record, and real changes of ownership, and real reasons for neighbors to wonder what the building had seen. Legends often begin with some fragment of truth, but the fragment is not the whole. The darkness of Franklin Castle lies partly in that exchange. A difficult human history was traded for a cleaner thrill. The complicated story of a German immigrant family, a cultural hall, a changing city, and a house searching for purpose became easier to sell as a curse. The public did not need to understand Cleveland's immigrant neighborhoods, 19th-century disease, architectural fashion, or the decline of ethnic institutions. It only needed to believe that something terrible was hidden behind the stone. And once that belief took hold, the house could not easily escape it. By the end of the 1970s, Franklin Castle had become more than a building. It had become a reputation. People came to it with expectations already formed. They stood before the tower and saw what they had been told to see. The old mansion, once built to announce arrival, now announced dread. Then the house gave the legend something physical. Not a rumor, not a story passed along the street, something found inside the walls. Every haunted house wants an object. A sound can be dismissed. A shadow can be explained. A witness can be doubted. But an object has weight. It can be held, photographed, placed in a newspaper, handed from one authority to another. It gives a story something solid to stand on. For Franklin Castle, that object was not a portrait, a diary, or a bloodstain. It was bone. By the middle of the 1970s, the mansion had already become a place people approached with expectation. Its new name had done its work. The old Tiedemann house was now Franklin Castle, and visitors came prepared to believe that the stone walls were hiding something. They had heard of dead children, grieving women, secret rooms, and a family history darkened by accusation. They looked at the tower and saw a warning. They stepped inside and listened for proof. Then, in 1975, during work inside the house, human bones were reportedly discovered in a wall cavity. For the legend, it was almost too perfect. The discovery seemed to give the rumors a body, not merely a feeling, not merely a story. A body, or at least part of one, sealed inside the building people already believed was cursed. In the public imagination, the distance between bones found in a wall and the legends were true was very short. It did not require a careful chain of evidence. It only required a house that looked guilty. But history has to move more slowly. The discovery of human remains in an old building is serious. It is also not self-explanatory. Bones do not speak in complete sentences. They do not announce how they arrived, when they were placed there, who handled them, or what meaning should be drawn from their presence. They can confirm that something real was found. They cannot, by themselves, confirm the story people most want to tell. That distinction is the center of this part of Franklin Castle's history. The bones were real enough to become part of the house's documented modern story. But their origin remained uncertain. Over time, several explanations were proposed. Some suggested the remains could have come from a nearby cemetery, perhaps disturbed, moved, or brought into the house under circumstances that were never fully recorded. Others suggested a medical explanation, that the bones may have belonged to an anatomical skeleton once used by a doctor or someone connected to medical study. Old houses, especially those that pass through many owners and uses, often accumulate objects whose original purpose is lost long before the object itself is found. Neither explanation has the satisfaction of a ghost story. That is why the darker version survived more easily. A cemetery explanation sounds accidental. A medical skeleton sounds strange, but not necessarily sinister. A murder story, on the other hand, seems to complete the architecture. It turns the wall into a hiding place, the tower into a witness, and the old family name into an accusation. The problem is that a satisfying story is not the same as a proven one. By 1975, Franklin Castle had already been prepared for this moment by years of rumor. If the same bones had been found in a plain farmhouse, the public reaction might have been different. People might have asked practical questions first. Who owned the house? Was there a doctor in the family? Had the property been altered? Was there a cemetery nearby? How old were the remains? But in Franklin Castle, the questions were crowded out by the building's reputation. The house had become a suspect before the evidence appeared. This is one of the most dangerous things a legend can do. It teaches people what conclusion to reach before the facts arrive. The wall cavity became more than a physical space. It became a moral stage. Into it, people placed everything they had already heard: the deaths, the whispered crimes, the idea that the Tiedemann family had left behind secrets too terrible for public record. The bones did not create the legend. They gave the legend a place to fasten itself, and yet the discovery also reveals something more interesting than the legend. It shows how old buildings keep material histories that outlast memory. A house can be altered again and again. Walls are opened, closed, repaired, covered, and rebuilt. Rooms are divided, pipes are run, electrical systems are added, owners leave objects behind, workers make shortcuts. Institutions reuse spaces in ways later occupants no longer understand. By the time someone opens a wall almost a century after a house is built, they may be entering not one past but many. Franklin Castle had already lived several lives by then. It had been the home of Hannes and Louise Tiedemann. It had held a family's grief and status. It had been sold. It had become Eintracht Hall, a place of German-American music and community. It had entered the age of haunted tours. Each period left traces. Some were written down, some were physical, some were misunderstood. The bones belonged somewhere in that layered history, but no one could confidently place them. That uncertainty should have made the story more careful. Instead, it made the house more famous. The discovery arrived at the exact moment when Franklin Castle's haunted identity was becoming useful. People wanted the building to be more than old. They wanted it to be charged. They wanted each room to contain a secret and each secret to point backward toward a crime. The bones gave the public what it had been waiting for. Not proof in the strict sense, but permission. Permission to believe harder. From that point on, the mansion's reputation changed in texture. Before, the stories could be dismissed as rumor, family tragedy misremembered, or the natural exaggeration that gathers around unusual buildings. After the bones, the legend gained a physical anchor. Even people who doubted the ghosts could not deny that something had been found inside the walls. The mystery became durable because it contained one confirmed fact surrounded by unanswered questions. That is often how the strongest legends survive. They do not need every detail to be true. They need one hard fact at the center, something no one can brush away. Around that fact, imagination builds rooms of its own. The confirmed discovery becomes a doorway. On the other side, rumor continues the tour. For the Tiedemann name, the consequences were severe. The bones made it easier for strangers to revisit the old accusations with new confidence, even though the discovery did not prove those accusations. Hannes Tiedemann, long dead by then, was pulled once more into a courtroom of public imagination, where evidence was optional and atmosphere mattered more than documentation. Louise and Emma, already reshaped by legend, remained trapped in stories that treated their suffering as entertainment. The house suffered too. Its architectural and cultural significance became harder to see beneath the growing fascination with what might be hidden inside it. Franklin Castle was now less a historic mansion than a mystery machine. The question people brought to it was no longer, who built this house and what did it mean to Cleveland? It was, what else is in the walls? That question would define the next chapter of its life. Because once a building becomes famous for secrets, people stop looking at it as a home. They stop looking at it as craft, memory, or civic history. They begin to look at it as a container waiting to be opened. And old houses, when treated only as containers for fear, can be damaged in ways no legend can repair. Fame did not save Franklin Castle. It made the house visible. It gave it a name people remembered. It brought visitors to the sidewalk and stories to newspapers. It turned the old Tiedemann Mansion into one of Cleveland's most recognizable private houses, a place where the city's history and its appetite for mystery met at the same iron gate. But visibility is not preservation. By the early 1980s, Franklin Castle had become famous enough to be known far beyond Franklin Boulevard. But that fame rested on uneasy ground. People knew the house as haunted before they knew it as historic. They knew the rumors before they knew the architects. They knew the bones in the wall before they knew Eintracht Hall. The legend had made the building memorable, but it had also narrowed the public's imagination. The house was no longer primarily a work of architecture, a German-American landmark, or the former home of a successful immigrant family. It was the cursed mansion. Then, in 1982, the official record caught up with another part of the truth. The house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places under the name Hannes Tiedemann House. That name mattered. It restored, at least on paper, the identity the legend had nearly buried. The designation recognized the building not because it was haunted, but because it had architectural and commercial significance. It belonged to the story of Cleveland's 19th-century growth, to the career of a man who had made his fortune in business and banking, and to the work of architects who had given Franklin Boulevard one of its most distinctive houses. For a moment, the old mansion seemed to stand between two futures. One future belonged to history. In that future, the house could be studied, restored, and understood in layers. Tiedemann residence, immigrant landmark, German-American hall, urban legend, and survivor of changing Cleveland. The other future belonged to spectacle. In that future, the house would remain useful mainly as a haunted object, valuable because people were afraid of it, curious about it, and willing to repeat its darkest stories. Both futures would follow it. In 1985, a new owner entered the story, and with him came a different kind of fame. Michael DeVinco, better known to many as Mickey Deans, purchased the house. His name carried its own public association because he had been the last husband of Judy Garland. That connection brought another layer of American celebrity to a house already burdened by legend. Franklin Castle, once tied to immigrant ambition and local community life, now stood at the intersection of historic preservation, haunted reputation, and popular culture. DeVinco did something more important than simply own it. He restored it. The house had already endured decades of changing use, curiosity, and rumor. A building of that size and age requires constant care. Stone must be maintained. Wood must be repaired. Roofs, windows, wiring, plumbing, plaster, and decorative detail all demand money and attention. Old houses decay not only because someone harms them, but because maintenance is relentless. Neglect is quiet, patient, and expensive to reverse. DeVinco spent heavily to bring the mansion back from decline. In doing so, he treated it as more than a haunted curiosity. He treated it as a place worth saving with labor, money, and time. The work did not erase the legends. Nothing could by then. But restoration changed the moral position of the house. It was no longer only something people came to consume. It was something someone had chosen to protect. That distinction matters in the life of any historic building. A crowd can admire a house and still let it rot. A city can repeat stories about a place while failing to care for its walls. Preservation begins when fascination becomes responsibility. Under DeVinco, Franklin Castle had at least one period in which responsibility returned. For more than a decade, the house stood not as an abandoned shell but as a restored residence. The old rooms, so often described as chambers of fear, again belonged to daily life. Doors opened for ordinary reasons. Lights were turned on, not for tours or investigations, but because someone lived there. A house that had been turned into a public myth was, for a time, returned to the private world from which it had first emerged. That private life did not free it from fame. By then, Franklin Castle's haunted reputation was too deeply set. The stories followed the building regardless of who held the deed. People continued to look at it through the old frame. A restoration could polish the wood and repair the damage, but it could not restore innocence. The house had become famous for what people believed it concealed, and belief is one of the hardest stains to remove from a building. Then the house changed hands again. After DeVinco sold Franklin Castle in 1999, the mansion entered one of the darkest physical chapters of its history. That same year, it was badly damaged by fire. The cause was reported as arson. For a building already associated with fear, the fire seemed to many like another act in the same doomed drama. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. Fire does not need a curse. It needs access, fuel, and neglect of human duty. The flames did what rumor never could. They injured the house itself. Legends can damage a reputation. Fire damages beams, floors, plaster, staircases, rooms, and the hidden structure that allows a building to stand. Smoke enters surfaces. Water used to fight the flames brings its own destruction. Openings appear where protection used to be. Weather follows. A house that has survived more than a century can be pushed suddenly toward ruin in a single night. Franklin Castle became a burned shell. That image changed the story again. The mansion that had once represented a rival now looked abandoned by the very city that could not stop talking about it. Fame had not kept the flames away. The haunted name had not protected the roof. The crowds, the rumors, the curiosity, the newspaper attention, the National Register listing, none of it had been enough to guarantee safety. This was the cruel paradox of Franklin Castle. The legend had helped keep the building in public memory. But memory alone could not hold up walls. The house was known, perhaps more widely than ever, yet it was also vulnerable. Its fame made it interesting. Its condition made it endangered. The same people who wanted to hear about the curse were not necessarily prepared to ask the harder question. What does a city owe to a building once the story becomes less entertaining than the repair bill? For old houses, this is often the final test. Not whether they are loved in the abstract, but whether anyone will pay the cost of their survival. Franklin Castle had already endured the loss of its first family, the fading of its German-American life, the invention of a haunted identity, and the discovery that fixed that identity in the public mind. Now it faced something less symbolic. It faced the possibility of disappearance. A burned mansion invites a different kind of silence. The rooms no longer wait for guests. They wait for assessment. The question becomes structural, financial, legal, and civic. Can it be saved? Who owns the responsibility? Is the building still a house, or has it become a ruin with a famous name? Franklin Castle did not answer immediately. It stood wounded, darkened, and exposed, carrying every name it had ever been given. Tiedemann House, Eintracht Hall, Franklin Castle's historic landmark, haunted mansion, burned shell. And for the first time in its long life, the question of whether the house was cursed seemed less important than whether it would remain standing at all. After the fire, Franklin Castle entered the most fragile part of any old building's life. It was still famous, but fame could not close a roof. It was still listed as historic, but a listing could not keep water out of burned rooms. It was still surrounded by stories, but stories do not repair joists, replace windows, stabilize masonry, or pay craftsmen to bring damaged woodwork back from the edge of loss. The house had survived more than a century of grief, reinvention, rumor, and public fascination. Now it had to survive the practical question that waits for every endangered building. Was anyone willing to save it? For years, the answer was uncertain. Franklin Castle stood with the strange dignity of a wounded thing. Its stone exterior still held the shape that had made people stop and stare for generations, but parts of the interior had been damaged badly. The house that once announced arrival now seemed to ask for mercy. It had become an object of curiosity, but also an object of obligation. Cleveland knew the mansion. Cleveland repeated its legends, but knowing a place and caring for it are not the same act. This is where the final transformation begins. In the 21st century, Franklin Castle was not rescued by forgetting its reputation. It was rescued in part by using it. That fact is uncomfortable, and it should be. The same haunted identity that had distorted the Tiedemann family history also kept the house in the public imagination. The same stories that turned grief into entertainment also made the building marketable enough to attract attention, visitors, and money. The curse, whether believed or not, became part of the economic machinery that allowed the house to live again. Old buildings often survive through compromise. A mansion built for one family may become a museum, a club, apartments, offices, an event space, a hotel, or a tourist attraction. The original purpose disappears, a new purpose takes its place. Purists may mourn the change, but without adaptation, many buildings are lost entirely. Preservation is rarely pure. It is usually a negotiation between memory and use. Franklin Castle's negotiation was especially difficult because its most profitable memory was also its most misleading one. To call the house haunted was easy. To explain Hannes Tiedemann, German immigration, 19th century disease, Franklin Boulevard, Eintracht Hall, the decline of ethnic institutions, the bones of uncertain origin, the National Register, the fire, and the long work of restoration was harder. A ghost story can be sold in one sentence. History asks for patience, but the house had already taught Cleveland what happens when patience disappears. When the Restoration era began, the work was not only physical. It was narrative. Owners and historians had to decide which Franklin Castle they were saving. Were they preserving the cursed mansion, the Tiedemann House, the German-American Hall, the architectural landmark, or the burned survivor? The honest answer was all of them. By then, the building could not be returned to one clean identity. Too many names had passed over the threshold. That is why the present life of Franklin Castle feels both hopeful and uneasy. On one hand, the house still stands. That alone is no small thing. Many buildings from its era have disappeared completely, reduced to photographs, tax records, and footnotes in local histories. Franklin Castle survived the loss of its first family, the end of its community life, decades of rumor, public spectacle, arson, and near ruin. Its stone walls remain on Franklin Boulevard, still carrying the shape Hannes Tiedemann commissioned in the 1880s. On the other hand, survival came at a price. The house is now known largely because of the very legends that injured its history. Visitors are still drawn by the possibility of ghosts, hidden rooms, and night sounds. They come because the name Franklin Castle promises an encounter with fear. The building's public life depends, at least partly, on the appetite that once buried the truth beneath rumor. That does not make every visitor careless. Many people arrive through the legend and leave with a deeper interest in the history. A haunted tour can become the first doorway into architecture, immigration, public memory, and the ethics of storytelling. Curiosity is not the enemy of history. But curiosity becomes dangerous when it refuses correction. The real darkness of Franklin Castle is not that people believe it may be haunted. Belief is personal, and old houses have always invited the imagination. The deeper darkness is that, for many years, the house's documented human story was treated as less valuable than the version that could be made frightening. A daughter was moved into a house she did not die in. A grieving family was rearranged into a legend. A successful immigrant was shadowed by accusations that records do not prove. A cultural hall that once held music and German-American civic life was nearly erased from public memory. The curse was not simply supernatural. The curse was bad history repeated until it felt like truth. And yet, Franklin Castle complicates even that judgment. Because without the bad history, the house might not be standing in the same way today. Without the fascination, perhaps fewer people would have noticed its decline. Without the haunted name, perhaps the restoration would have lacked the public attention that gave the building a new future. The legend harmed the house, but it also helped keep the house alive. That is the paradox at the center of Franklin Castle. It was built to prove that one family had arrived. It became a shelter for grief. It became a hall for a community trying to preserve its identity. It became a haunted attraction. It became a mystery after bones were found in a wall. It became a landmark. It became a burned shell. And then it became something even stranger. A historic building whose survival depended on the public's desire to enter the story that had distorted it. Perhaps that is why the mansion still holds attention after more than 140 years. Not because every legend is true, not because every room hides a secret, But because Franklin Castle shows how easily a building can be taken from the people who made it and handed over to the stories others need it to tell. The house on Franklin Boulevard was not born cursed. It was born hopeful. The curse came later, not from the dead, but from the living. From our hunger for mystery, our impatience with ordinary grief, and our habit of turning complicated lives into simpler tales. What remains is a mansion still standing between fact and folklore, asking each generation to decide which one it has come to see.